thanks a million. I really appreciate Stoughton choosing the caning as their Stoughton Reads book. It's wonderful to see people come in with it. Some of them are dog-eared, some of them are half-read, some of them are read completely. I had somebody just say to me, oh, I haven't quite got done yet, and so that's all terrific. I really appreciate that. And the programs that you guys are doing seem wonderful. I am hesitant to attend the caning reenactment that's coming up. I really like to see how that goes. I did hear somebody say no blood will be, it does say no blood will be shed, so that's good. But that must really be interesting. I haven't seen one of those, so I'll have to kind of check that out. I thought what we would do tonight is I'll talk to you guys a little bit about the book, the making of the book, some of the research, the story, the caning, slavery, all that kind of stuff. And at the end of it, we'll do questions and answers, if that works. When we get to the Q&A part, it's really my favorite part of these programs. So please do feel free to ask just about anything, whether it's about writing, publishing, the story, slavery, history. Well, anything's fair game. And then at the end of the night, I'll sign over here. I have a mailing list over here. If you're not on my mailing list and want to be, I don't spam you. I do like 3 mailings a year. That'll tell you kind of what's up with Steve Puleo. Would you get that? That's Charles Sumner on the line for this woman. Please silence your cell phones. Yes. Excellent. That's right. Thank you. So please do that, and please do pick up, if you haven't, a bookmark that I have out there. So I would love you to have that as well. So let's talk a little bit, I think, about the 2 main characters in this book, Charles Sumner and Preston Brooks. Very interesting characters in my view. And when you do the research, when I do the research for a story, when I decide what book to write or what topic to write about, one of the real things you want to look for are strong, compelling characters with a lot of depth. So, you know, we're human beings, right? We all have different parts and different layers of our lives. We have good things about us, we have bad things about us, right? And so Sumner and Brooks fall into that category, I think, in many, many different ways when you look at these 2. And of course, the regions they come from, very, very reflective of the beliefs in each of those regions for the most part. So Charles Sumner very much is a Boston guy. Let's think about this. Charles Sumner is a graduate of Harvard. He's a lawyer in the Boston area. He grew up his house was on Beacon Hill, the backside of Beacon Hill on Hancock Street. He's buried at Mount Auburn Cemetery, right? There's a statue of him in Harvard. There's a statue of him in the Public Garden, standing there on this big base. The word just says Sumner on it if you're ever at the Public Garden, which at the time was all you really needed for Charles Sumner. When that went up in 1897, the memory of Sumner, very much alive. He was very, very much well known at this time. So he's a Boston guy. Most of my research took place in the Boston area. His papers are at Harvard, at the Houghton Library. They are at the Mass Historical Society, many of his speeches. And the Boston Public Library has all of his letters on microfilm. And he wrote thousands of letters. He was a huge letter writer and received hundreds and hundreds of letters, many of them after this episode, after the caning. So keep that in mind. Charles Sumner, probably for 25 years, the strongest, most unwavering anti-slavery voice in America. So from about 1849 to about his death in 1874, right up to his death. So for that quarter century, the loudest, strongest anti-slavery voice is not Lincoln, it's not Garrison, it's Charles Sumner, no question about it. Flip side of Charles Sumner, remember I told you there's these many layers. Flip side of Charles Sumner, he's not a very nice guy. He's not a very likable guy. He has a difficult time relating to people, a difficult time making friendships and alliances in a business that requires alliances, politics, right? He has barely no relationship with his family, almost none. He's kind of condescending and arrogant and humorless. His friends can only take him in very, very small doses. Now, we all have friends like that, right? You know, we do. Sumner was one of these guys. You could take him in small doses. But so he has this great, strong anti-slavery positioning, but he's a tough guy to get to like. And that comes into play in this caning story, very much so, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Preston Brooks. Preston Brooks from South Carolina. And I was very privileged to be able to get down to South Carolina to do the research on this book. Brooks is from Edgefield, South Carolina, the western part of the state. For you golf fans, about a half an hour from Augusta, Georgia. For you Masters fans, that's where it is. Edgefield is among, at the time, the most pro-slavery section of the most pro-slavery state, South Carolina. Very influential state, very powerful state in the pro-slavery movement. Edgefield, very influential section. So I was able to get down there. I did my research, most of my research at the University of South Carolina in Columbia, USC, the other USC they call it in South Carolina. So that was great. That's where most of Preston Brooks's papers are. So it was wonderful to go through there. And then I went out to his hometown in Edgefield, and it's really this, picture postcard town. It's beautiful. I got to meet the town historian, the county historian, who was, kind enough to show me around. Took me to the 2 houses that are now privately owned that Brooks once owned. Took me to Brooks's grave. And the county historian in Edgefield is also the owner of one of the real nice restaurants in Edgefield, the Edgefield Town Grill. So I had my first dish of shrimp and grits when I went there. Fabulous, fabulous. And the owner, who's the county historian and the owner, is also, ironically enough, or coincidentally enough, a graduate of Harvard University. Came up here, went to school, went back to Edgefield. And I said to him, Bettis, you cannot get good shrimp and grits up north. And he said, that's true, Steve. He did a nice southern drawl. That's true, Steve. But you cannot get good Chinese down here, is what he said. So that was kind of like our little north-south back and forth that we had. So it was really great to go down there and do the research and to learn a little bit about Preston Brooks, the area he was from. I saw the sections where his plantations were, where they would have been. So that was great, too, as part of the research. The other thing that the research kind of shows to me and kind of demonstrated to me was this. So today we hear people say on the news and we hear people say in Washington, oh, we have never been so polarized. We have never been so partisan ever in American history. There's always this in-the-moment feeling that things have never been worse. It happens a lot. In 2008, when we had the financial meltdown, people say, is this the worst it's ever been? And I would say, well, I hear 1934 wasn't that great, et cetera. So you have that. A lot of times when you're in the moment, you think it's always the worst, the biggest, the better, the best. But you always hear people say it's our most polarizing partisan time right now. Not true, right? I think there's no debate that the most polarizing, partisan, uncompromising decade in American history was the 1850s, was the run-up decade to the Civil War. No question about it. Now, we never want to get that polarized again. We never want to get to that point where we have a war between the states, awful war. 700,000 dead on both sides, amazing when you think about it. Terrible, terrible conflict. But just to keep things in perspective, the 1850s, far worse than we're dealing with now. When you're doing the research and when you're thinking about what the topics are that they talked about in the 1850s versus what we talk about now, think about it. So now what do we talk about? We talk about things like health care. How should we pay for health care? Illegal immigration, what do we do about it? Controversial, sure, but what do we do about it? Taxes, who pays taxes, how much do they pay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But think about the issues that were being debated on the floor of the Congress in the 1850s. They were issues like, should one man be able to own another? Right? Should one man be able to sell a husband to one owner, a wife to a second owner, and their children to a third owner, which happened frequently, right? Are blacks people or are they property? Part of the discussion, part of the debate on the floor of the Congress. So the issues that we're talking about then were really insurmountable and literally insurmountable. They led to a civil war. So at least for me, when I saw what they were dealing with then, and I look at what we're dealing with now, it kind of makes me feel like the issues we're dealing with now should be more manageable, that we should be able to get there. We should be able to reach some compromise on those issues when you think about it. So it's kind of like the lesson I learned from some of the research that I did. And so when I talk about this topic, I say, well, what was so different about the 1850s? I mean, America had been making compromises on the slavery issue literally since her founding, right? Thomas Jefferson's rough draft of the Declaration of Independence had some anti-slavery, anti-slave trade paragraph in it, and it got removed during discussions. Concerns that the Declaration of Independence might not have been adopted with that in there. In 1787, during the Constitutional Convention, there's a lot of debate about slavery, discussions about slavery. Not much on the moral side, but mostly how do we count slaves? And finally, we reached the 3/5 compromise. Remember? They'd be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation in the House. That's how we would do it. But not much in the way of the moral issue of slavery. Why? Big concerns that if some kind of anti-slavery language was placed into the Constitution, might have been tough. It might have been difficult for the South Carolinians to ratify. It might have been difficult for the Georgians to ratify. And indeed, might have been difficult for some of the northern states, New Jersey one of them, a couple others, to ratify as well. There was some real controversy about that. So the Founding Fathers do put in the Constitution veiled language. They don't use the word slavery. That doesn't appear in the Constitution at all until the 13th Amendment abolishes it. But they put veiled language in the Constitution that says that the slave trade would end in 1808, in about 20 years. Now, in fairness to the Founding Fathers, who I have a great deal of admiration and respect for, in fairness to them, most of them thought slavery would die its own death in somewhere between a decade or two. And there was great concern that the Constitution being ratified was much more important, in that, in fact, if it was ratified, that may have hastened the end to slavery. That's the compromise that they're working with. You know, for us to look back in 2015, that sounds almost unbelievable. But back in 1787, that's the compromise that they were working with, that they were thinking about. And so they thought it would end in about a decade. 10 years, 15 years, they thought it would fade out. But an accident of technology occurs, right? In 1823, 1824, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin, which increases the output of an average slave by about a factor of 50, and literally creates big cotton, the huge cotton thriving industry that the South depends on, relies on, customers in Europe, customers across the North, etc. That comes about because of the cotton gin, and slavery carries on. So there are still compromises. During the 1810s, in that period, that first 20 years of the 1800s, there's small compromises that happen. And then in 1820, right, the first large compromise on slavery occurs, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And by the way, those of you in high school, that's good. Those of you not in high school, I'm going to be talking about some things that you went home to your parents and said, why do I need to know this? Why do I need to know about the Missouri Compromise? Well, you do need to know about it. You do. And the Missouri Compromise is this really convoluted compromise that Congress comes up with. And what does it say? It says that everything south of the very famous 3630 parallel, you remember that? The 3630 parallel, everything south of it, slavery would be allowed. Everything north of the 3630 parallel, slavery would be prohibited, except in one state, Missouri, which is almost totally north of the 3630 parallel. Pretty convoluted, pretty amazing. And by the way, to kind of balance things off, since Missouri's coming in as a slave state, we're going to create a brand new free state we're going to take a big chunk of Massachusetts, and we're going to create a brand new state called Maine. So when you go to a Gunkwit and you get those T-shirts that say founded 1820 Maine, it's the Missouri Compromise that creates the state of Maine. So pretty incredible sort of compromise that goes on with Congress. But the compromise keeps a lid on the tinderbox of slavery. Keeps a lid on it. Through the 1830s and the 1840s, right? The three great compromise senators get into the act and compromise on slavery. And you know who they are: John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, Henry Clay of Kentucky, the great compromiser, and from Massachusetts, the very famous, very well-known who?
Webster.
What's his first name?
Daniel.
Thank you, because of course Noah Webster is the dictionary guy. So yes, Daniel Webster. Those are the three great compromise senators in the 30s and 40s. And keep in mind, this is pre-Abraham Lincoln, so pre-real strong presidencies. Senators were more powerful than presidents during these couple of decades. They really were. So these guys had a lot of influence. And again, the tamp is put on the slavery debate. It's still there. It's simmering. It's under the surface. The abolitionists are making noise up north, but they're on the fringe. That's a fringe group. It's a fringe group well into the 1850s. But something changes. Something changes in 1850. Two things, I think, change that alter the slavery debate and make compromise more difficult. The caning happens after those two things, so that's the third thing. And the caning, I think, makes civil war unavoidable. It is the event, I position it as such, it is the event that is the no turning back point on the road to civil war. But the two things that happened before, let's talk about them, because they're what lead to the caning.
Fugitive slave law.
You want to come up here and do the presentation? Okay, so here we are. This woman says the fugitive slave law. She's brilliant. Yes. So in 1850, it happens in 1850. It's another compromise that Congress makes called, very simply, the Compromise of 1850. I love that. Nice and easy. You know exactly what it is. The Compromise of 1850 comes about because of a very strange event in American history, totally unrelated to the compromise, the discovery of gold in California. Very odd, right? But here's what happens. Gold gets discovered in California in late 1848. Thousands of people go to California as part of the gold rush. It becomes populated, California does, so quickly that it almost skips the territory stage and applies for statehood very quickly in 1849. Only one problem. At the time California applies for statehood, there are 30 states in the Union. 15 of them are free, 15 of them are slave. California applies for admission to the Union as a free state. The South is very nervous about this. Very nervous. They're afraid, number one, literally, that tips the balance in Congress. That tips the representation in Congress. But more figuratively, they're afraid if California comes in as a free state, that the momentum for slavery will be seriously damaged. I think correctly so. And so they demand something in return. What they demand in return is this Compromise of 1850, which has several pieces to it. Again, kind of convoluted. But the biggest part of that Compromise of 1850, now you can say it, was the fugitive slave law. That is a huge piece of the compromise and the biggest piece of it. By the way, fashioned, this compromise was, by none other than Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. Ironically enough, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts probably hastens the Civil War with the fugitive slave law. He says when he's finished, the Union stands firm, and that was his goal, but it was a terrible political miscalculation. And what did the fugitive slave law say? Here's what it said. Up to this point, if you were a runaway slave and you made it to a free state, a northern state, you made it to Canada, whatever, you were free. You were essentially free. There was a weak fugitive slave law in place from the 1700s that was almost unenforceable. But you were free. The new fugitive slave law said this, that if a slave escaped from a southern state, from a slave state, and made it to a free state, when those slave hunters came hunting, which they almost always did, particularly for males between the age of 19 and 25, the most valuable males, the most valuable pieces of property. Males between the ages of 19 and 25, they almost always came after. When they did so, that the state to which they fled, their police department, their court system, their sheriffs, were required to help send them back to slavery, capture them and send them back to slavery. They had to help the slave hunters. And so this manifests itself in Boston first in 1851, when Boston sends her first runaway slave back to slavery. His name is Thomas Sims. He's an escaped slave from Georgia, the Savannah area in Georgia, escaped on a ship, made his way up to Boston, lived in South Boston for a while, made his way to downtown, and one day on the streets of Boston, slave hunters come, they find him, they capture him. Boston police assist in the arrest. He goes through a court hearing here in the city, and he is shipped back to slavery, to bondage. The abolitionist community in Boston at the time, very active abolitionist community, is appalled by this. They're outraged by this. They're humiliated by this. They're angry by it. That Boston, the cradle of liberty, right? The cradle of liberty, where it all began, sends a slave back to slavery. Very, very upset. The Boston abolitionist movement up to this point had been largely a speech-making and writing organization, not very militant up to this point. In fact, some of the more militant abolitionists, there were a few, some of the more militant abolitionists like Thomas Wentworth Higginson used to get upset at folks like Garrison and those guys and say, you're not really into it. You're part of the cause, but you don't want to get your hands dirty. After Thomas Sims gets sent back, the Boston abolitionist movement changes, does a 180, and becomes much more militant. And over the next 10 years, they help about 300 slaves escape, and they do it in very tangible ways. They do it with money, they do it with food, clothing, alibis, hiding places, etc., etc. It changes the way the abolitionist movement in Boston occurs, and that extends across the North. The abolitionist movement across the North, after the Thomas Sims case, becomes much more militant and much more active. The second thing that the Thomas Sims case, that the fugitive slave law did, is this. Most people in the North and in Massachusetts were not abolitionists. They viewed abolitionists as very much a fringe group. Most of them kind of felt, well, most were ambivalent about slavery. Ambivalent. So they didn't want to get involved in this big effort to end slavery. Maybe they were opposed to it extending any further. But for the most part, it wasn't a big issue to them up here in the North. They thought abolitionists were too extreme. Many people in the North, right, got very, very rich in the textile industry. The textile industry used as its main raw material cotton that was sent from the South and picked by slaves. So there was a real good business arrangement between North and South. Not a lot of appetite among these moderates to abolish slavery. However, once Thomas Sims gets sent back, the moderates in Massachusetts and the moderates across the North become very uneasy. They are queasy. They are queasy that Boston sends a slave back to bondage. They do not feel good about it. They may not be part of the movement, but they do not feel good about it. And that carries on for most of the 1850s. Very, very important mindset change among the non-abolitionists. I think maybe more important than the change among the abolitionists, with a change among the majority of the people who were non-abolitionists. So that's one of the big, big changes in the 1850s. The second big event that happens in the 1850s. Happens in 1854. This woman is dying to tell me what it is. What is it? I see you nodding your head over there. What is it? You don't know. This gentleman has it. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. Another one of those things you came home and said to your parents, why do I need to know the Kansas-Nebraska Act? It's late. I want to watch TV. I want to go out. What? The Kansas-Nebraska Act, incredibly important in 1854. And here's what the Kansas-Nebraska Act said. It's a compromise, again, that Congress works out. The act is put forward by a northerner by the name of Stephen Douglas. You know Stephen Douglas from Illinois. So Stephen Douglas puts forth the following proposition. He says, instead of this whole Missouri Compromise thing, how about these two territories, Kansas and Nebraska, that want to come into the Union as states, how about instead of, where they sit geographically according to latitude and longitude, how about we let the people in those territories vote as to whether they want slavery or not when they're admitted? He called it popular sovereignty, the little fancy name that he gave this voting thing, popular sovereignty. Well, the South is really kind of excited and thrilled about this. Why? Because they believe they can send a bunch of people from pro-slavery Missouri, which kind of borders Kansas, does border Kansas, and they will send people from the South to Kansas. Nebraska, a little too far north for slavery to be a real, practical, viable system. Kansas, though, perfect. So they could send people from the South into Kansas to basically stuff the ballot boxes. No question about it. And indeed, there were many examples of states encouraging this. In Alabama and Mississippi, ladies sold their jewelry to finance expeditions to Kansas. The state of South Carolina, Preston Brooks' state, the state of South Carolina offered $200 if you would make that trek west to Kansas. So thousands of people from the South go to Kansas. And they are counteracted by thousands of abolitionists and anti-slavery folks from the North who go to Kansas. Kansas becomes the real center of the slavery debate in 1855. Now, why does Stephen Douglas do this? What an odd thing for Stephen Douglas, the Northerner, to do. The North, by the way, totally outraged by Douglas's actions. Totally outraged. He's burned in effigy in the North during demonstrations and rallies. In fact, at one point, Stephen Douglas said he believed he could find his way home from Washington, D.C. to Illinois by the light of his own burning effigies. I thought, wow. Today we would call that, what? High unfavorability ratings. But yes, he knew that he had made this mistake. Why did he do it? Why did Stephen Douglas do it? He did it for a couple reasons. Number one, he had designs on the presidency and believed he would need Southern Democrats to support him, which I think is true, to win the presidency. So kind of threw the South a bone there. And two, in 1854, there was lots of talk, the beginning talk, about a transcontinental railroad across the United States. Now, it doesn't happen for another dozen years. But the transcontinental railroad, Douglas wanted the eastern terminus of that railroad to be in his home state, Chicago. The South wanted the eastern terminus to be in St. Louis. That was what they wanted. And so Douglas makes this move, Kansas, Nebraska, as a way to mollify the South and maybe get the Transcontinental Railroad at some point. You see these unconnected things in history often do have connections. So there is violence in Kansas. There are riots in Kansas. There are clashes between North and South. There are murders in Kansas. Lawrence is sacked. Topeka is destroyed. Equipment and tools and buildings are destroyed, thrown into the river. It is a violent place for almost all of 1855. The center of the slavery debate in the United States is not Massachusetts, it's not South Carolina, it's not Washington, D.C., it's the geographic center of the American continent, it's Kansas. That's the debate in 1855. And a United States senator from Massachusetts named Charles Sumner is in the Senate at the time. Anti-slavery senator, big anti-slavery senator. How did he get there? I'll tell you how he got there. In 1851, when Daniel Webster became vice president and there was a vacancy, right after the Thomas Sims case, the Massachusetts state legislature fills the seat, the United States Senate seat. Keep in mind, United States senators were not elected directly by the people until 1913. So the legislature appointed the United States senator. Charles Sumner, nobody's favorite choice, was finally elected on the 26th ballot after this contentious back and forth between the legislature. On the 26th ballot, finally, Sumner emerges as kind of a dark horse candidate and gets elected to the Senate. He's one of 2 or 3 abolitionists at the time. So in 1855, he's watching what's going on in Kansas. He's getting letters from people in Kansas that are saying, help us, do something. And he's dying to give a speech on what's going on in Kansas. But he can't get the floor at the end of 1855. Leadership doesn't give him the floor. They don't give him the floor of the Senate in January, February, March of 1856. And finally, the leadership says, you can speak on this issue. You can speak on this issue in May. In May, you can have the floor and talk about this issue. So on May 19th, 1856, in a jam-packed Senate chamber where one New York reporter said even the ladies' galleries were filled to overflowing, which almost never happened, Charles Sumner stands up to deliver one of the most famous speeches in American history. It is a 5-hour speech, 3 hours on the first day, 3 hours on the second day, 5 hours long, entitled The Crime Against Kansas. I will now recite the entire 5 hours. No. It is a major, major speech about what's happening in Kansas. And it's packed for a couple reasons. Number one, Sumner is a very good orator. He's a good speaker. People know that. But number two, you could never quite tell what was going to come out of Charles Sumner's mouth. He liked to use personal insults. He liked to use personal invective. He always said he believed that made his political points more powerful. There was this kind of great anticipation. What would Sumner say? Who would he insult? A little bit of a kind of a train wreck mentality to the crowd. They wanted to see what was going to happen. And Charles Sumner does not disappoint. He does not disappoint. If Charles Sumner had only talked about the slavery issue in Kansas, we would certainly not be here today. You wouldn't be reading this book. Who knows what else would have happened? Not sure. Had he only talked about slavery. And he does that. He does that a great deal. But he also decides to do this. He also decides to insult the senior senator from South Carolina, Andrew Butler, to insult him personally. Now, Butler, at the time, is not even in the Senate chamber. He is home, recovering from a stroke. He had a stroke that paralyzed a side of his face. And he had a very difficult time speaking. He even spit a little bit when he spoke because of the stroke. Charles Sumner makes fun of that affliction in his speech. Andrew Butler, kind of an older gentleman, kind of quintessential pro-slavery Southerner. Sumner goes after him, makes fun of him for spitting. And he also says that Butler had a mistress who was ugly and polluted in the eyes of the rest of us, but lovely and chaste in his eyes. I am talking about the harlot slavery. So he uses this image of slavery as a prostitute and calling him Butler's mistress. Now, northern senators and congressmen who heard the speech were uneasy at Sumner's remarks. In fact, Stephen Douglas in the back of the room was heard to have said, "That damn fool is going to get himself killed by another damn fool." Southerners outraged by the speech. That Sumner would go after Andrew Butler, that Butler wasn't even there, and that he would go after him personally, seemed like the greatest offense possible. Howls of protest after the speech from the Southerners all over Washington, D.C. And one Southerner in particular is really, really angry. And he's a congressman from Edgefield, South Carolina, Preston Brooks. And Preston Brooks is angry not only because he's from the same state as Andrew Butler, but that he's Andrew Butler's second cousin. He's his kin. He's his relative. He feels an obligation under the Southern Code of Honor to avenge Andrew Butler's honor and to do something to Charles Sumner. But what to do? What to do? He gathers with some of his colleagues on the 21st in the afternoon and in the evening of the 21st of May, trying to figure out just what he could do to Sumner to get revenge. Some people suggest a duel. They decide against that because dueling was considered only a way for gentlemen to settle their differences, and the Southerners, and Brooks included, believed Charles Sumner did not rise to the level of a gentleman. So they put that aside. No dueling. He doesn't rate a duel. Brooks says, how about I just call him outside, man to man, and we do fisticuffs. We settle it that way. Most of his colleagues say, nope, Sumner's too arrogant. He will not come outside. He will demand that you go to his desk. They decide no on that. And finally, Preston Brooks comes up with what he's going to do. And on the late morning of May 22nd, 1856, he takes his wooden cane, his gutta-percha cane with a gold knob. He walks to the Capitol, sits outside the Capitol where Sumner usually goes in, near that entrance. They miss connections. They miss connections. He doesn't see them. And shortly after noontime, both the House and Senate adjourned because there was a funeral for one of the representatives. And a few of the House members, Brooks included, make their way over to the Senate chamber. In the Senate chamber, which is now adjourned, as I said, there are about 35 people milling about. There is a few senators, there's a sergeant at arms, there's a few people from the press, there are a few staffers, all kind of milling about. Preston Brooks comes in with his colleague, Lawrence Keat from South Carolina, with his cane, comes in, sits down, looks up at the front of the aisle and sees Charles Sumner seated at his desk, similar to this desk, not exactly like this, but similar to this desk, about the same height. And he sees Charles Sumner, this big man. Sumner's about 6 feet, which is tall for the time, 6 feet, 6'1". He's at his desk, legs pinned underneath the desk, writing. Turns out he was signing autographs, franking his crime against Kansas speech. That's the term that was used for his constituents. It had already been printed. He had had it printed beforehand, and he was franking copies of his speech, oblivious to what's going on. Brooks sits down. He sits down, he says later, because, why? Because there's a lady in the Senate chamber. And she is talking to the sergeant of arms, and he can't do what he came to do with a lady present. She talks for about another 10 minutes and then leaves. Preston Brooks stands up, walks down that center aisle. Charles Sumner still writing, head down, no idea what's going on. Brooks walks up to Sumner, raises his cane, and as he's raising his cane, he says, Senator, I have read over your speech twice. It is a libel to my state and my relative. Sumner's looking up at the time, has his spectacles on, and as he looks up, Preston Brooks comes down as hard as he can on his head with the cane. Bang. Sumner's, literally, his head bursts into blood on the first blow. And with that, Preston Brooks loses it. I'll use the 2015 term, he loses it. Bloodlust, whatever. The moment, I don't know. But he begins to hit Sumner again and again with his cane. Sumner desperately can't move. He's pinned underneath the desk. He can't roll. He's got his chair's on wheels, but he kind of forgets that. And he doesn't roll back. He's trying to get up. Brooks is hitting him. Sumner finally gives this great strain, this mighty lunge, and literally rips the desk that's manacled to the floor, rips it from its moorings, falls over. Brooks keeps coming after him. Later, Brooks said, I hit him with 30 first-rate stripes. Every one of them went exactly where I intended, and at the end, he was bellowing like a calf. He beats Sumner again and again. His cane starts to shatter. In the middle of the beating, one person tries to get up to help. It's a newspaper man from New York. And Lawrence Keats says, stand back, let them be. Let them go at it. Brooks beats Sumner into unconsciousness. He's in a pool of his own blood. The cane is totally shattered. Brooks is literally holding onto the gold and the knob end. Finally, Brooks's friend pulls his arm aside and pulls it back and says, let us go. Do not kill him. Do not kill him. Sumner is totally unconscious. And Keat and Brooks leave the United States Capitol and walk outside. A few of Sumner's colleagues bring him to an anteroom that's adjacent to the chamber. A doctor visits him there, treats his scalp in a very quick manner, and then they take him home to his lodgings in Washington, D.C., where a doctor comes again. And just before he slips into unconsciousness again, Charles Sumner says, I can't believe that such a thing was possible. I can't believe that such a thing was possible. Charles Sumner has terrible head injuries, neck injuries, back trauma, I believe some brain trauma, etc., as a result of this beating. He is out of the Senate for over 3 years, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but he's out of the Senate for over 3 years as a result of the beating. But the very next day, news of the caning sweeps across America like a brush fire. This is post-telegraph. Post-telegraph, so newspapers get it right away. There are 3,000 newspapers in America at this time. Almost everybody reads one. Almost every single one of them told the story of the caning on the front page. An amazing story that goes across the country, with two very different reactions. In the North, complete outrage. Northerners, even those Northerners, those conservatives, those moderates who didn't want to get involved in the abolitionist movement, those folks were outraged. They viewed it as a free speech issue. That regardless of Charles Sumner insulting Andrew Butler, nobody should have to be subjected to a beating just because they spoke. Very, very angry in the North as a result of that. Sumner's supporters grow in the North as a result of the caning. In the South, very, very different. The reaction was one of great support for Preston Brooks. Preston Brooks becomes a hero in the South. He is celebrated. He receives hundreds of canes as gifts to replace the cane that shattered, many of them inscribed with the words, "Hit him again." He becomes a real hero in the South in many, many ways. The ramifications of the caning start almost immediately. The very next day, an abolitionist in Kansas by the name of John Brown, remember him? John Brown is in Kansas. He is out there with his sons and a few of his other men that he took out there, gets word of the caning, gets word of Sumner's beating. And in the words of his son, he lost it. He went crazy. And John Brown and his sons that night and the next night proceed to murder in very gruesome, savage ways 5 pro-slavery men in Kansas. Pulling them out of their house at night, going into the house, pulling them out, and again, in very kind of graphic, savage ways, which I do talk about in the book, kill these 5 guys. John Brown, the mad abolitionist, is born as a direct result of the caning. When the South gets word of Brown's actions, Now they're even more furious at abolitionists. No longer are abolitionists just people who want to end their way of life and ruin them economically and financially. No, now abolitionists are capable of gruesome murders. That was the reaction to John Brown's actions in the South. The second big ramification, and I think even more important, that happens through the summer of 1856 and into the early fall of 1856 is this. As a result of this beating, as a result of the South's reaction to it, glorifying it, thousands upon thousands of people in the North join the brand new anti-slavery Republican Party. Very huge ramification from this. So many people joined the Republican Party, and this is a new party. It started 18 months earlier in some states, 9 months earlier, that's all in some states. But so many people join it that in the presidential election of 1856, they put up their first candidate, John C. Fremont. Fremont almost wins the presidency. He doesn't. He almost wins the presidency with no Southern electoral votes. Now, he loses a few northern states, but the South sees very quickly that a united North could elect a president without any Southern votes. They see that in 1856. That ends up happening in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln is elected with no Southern votes, electoral votes. But in 1856, the South sees that that could happen. Charles Sumner is trying to get back to work. He can't. He's so injured during this period of time. But even his northern colleagues, his anti-slavery abolitionist buddies, they don't really want him to get back to work. Why? Because they say, your vacant chair speaks even more eloquently than you. It's a great recruiting tool to join the Republican Party, seeing this vacant chair that Charles Sumner once occupied. So it's a huge momentum boost, and it continues into 1857. It's the spirit of Charles Sumner.
Definitely,
So, yes. It continues into 1857, and then in January of 1857, one of the most remarkable parts of this story occurs, one of the most remarkable episodes in this story. Late January of 1857, 37-year-old Preston Brooks, congressman from South Carolina, dies in Washington, D.C. from a throat infection. Suddenly, unexpectedly, he was sick for a couple days, but he dies. There's a huge funeral in D.C. President goes, congressman goes, everybody goes. Northern and Southerners go out of respect. But then the remarkable thing happens. 26 men from Edgefield, South Carolina, come to D.C. to take Preston Brooks's body back to Edgefield for burial. And along the way, they go by boat, they go by stagecoach, they go by horseback. Along the way, thousands upon thousands of Southerners turn out in town squares along the roadway to pay homage to Preston Brooks's body as it comes by. Amazing. Make no mistake about this, folks. Make no mistake about this. Between the caning in May of 1856 and Preston Brooks' death in January of 1857, so that's 7 or 8 month period, Preston Brooks is as big in the South as John C. Calhoun was before him and as Robert E. Lee was after him. As big. Now, he doesn't have the historical staying power of either of those two guys, but in the moment, he's as big, he's as celebrated, he's as heroic. The North is aghast at this funeral celebration, this kind of paying homage to the body as it goes by on its way to Edgefield. Some Northerners even said, if the South could only have expressed a little bit of outrage, we could have chalked this up to a hot-headed congressman who lost his temper. But because they didn't, because they lionized Brooks, the North is left with nowhere to go except to support Sumner, to support the abolitionists, to support the anti-slavery movement in the gulf between North and South continues to grow bigger and bigger and wider and wider. In 1857, the United States Supreme Court, made up mostly of Southerners, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney, a friend of the Brookses and a Southern sympathizer, come out with one of the, most people think one of the worst decisions in Supreme Court history, in American history, the Dred Scott case. Remember Dred Scott? Happens in March of 1857, right after the Brooks funeral, right in the midst of the environment caused by the caning. The Dred Scott case, talk about a convoluted case, has many different elements to it. Try reading it sometime. Boy, it's tough to understand, but it has many different elements to it. But for our sake, it has two main elements that were important. One, the case rules that blacks are property, not people, and that therefore they have no standing to sue, which is what Dred Scott did. So that was one. And two, they ruled that Congress had no right to prohibit slavery anywhere in the United States. Only the states could do that, they said. So forget this Missouri Compromise, forget this Kansas-Nebraska Act, forget all that. Congress has no right to prohibit slavery anywhere. Stephen Douglas even said, wow, I could wake up in Illinois and Illinois could be a slave state. But it's done. But it's done in the midst of the environment created by the caning. Important to remember that. In 1858, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They debate for the senatorship of Illinois. They have 7 debates that are 3 hours long. Tens of thousands of people come in the pouring rain, in the baking sun to hear these 2 debates. And several times Abraham Lincoln says, Brooks is dead now. And several times, boy, there's a lot going on here tonight. A lot of ghosts of Stoughton's past reacting here tonight. But Abraham Lincoln says, if all the Southerners are like Brooks, perhaps there is no compromise. In 1859, John Brown makes his way from Kansas to Massachusetts, still on the lam for those murders earlier, makes his way from Kansas to Massachusetts, looking to raise $30,000 so that he can raid the federal arsenal in Virginia, later to be West Virginia, so that he can spark a slave uprising. He does raise his $30,000 in Massachusetts. And before he leaves here to head south, he says, I want to meet Charles Sumner. He goes to Sumner's quarters. Sumner says, would you like to see the coat I was wearing when I was beaten? It still has the bloodstains on it. And Brown says, I'd like that. They go to the closet. He reaches for the coat. Brown says later, I looked at it. I felt as though I were touching the hem of the garment of a martyr. A lot of martyr talk between these two. John Brown heads south. His raid on Harper's Ferry fails miserably. He's captured and he's hanged. And he becomes a martyr in his own right, particularly in the North, particularly in Massachusetts, but certainly in the North. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected President of the United States. A couple weeks later, the South begins to secede from the Union, led by South Carolina first, Preston Brooks' state, the now deceased Preston Brooks, and then the rest of them. And in April, of course, of 1861, Fort Sumter is fired upon and the Civil War begins. The caning, my book, takes you right up to the start of the Civil War and the implications of what happened as a result of the caning that led us there. The dominoes fall very fast, even though it takes 5 years. 5 years from May of 1856, when Sumner is beaten, to April of 61, when the Civil War starts. But things are irreversible as a result of that. A couple other things, and then we'll open it up to your questions. Thing number one, Charles Sumner. So people say, what happened to Charles Sumner? I told you he was out of the Senate for 3 years. He tries desperately to get back. He tries everything to get back. He goes to the mountains to rest. He goes to the seashore to rest. He goes to Europe to rest. And while he's in Europe, he hooks up with a French surgeon who puts forth this theory, a new treatment for spinal injuries and back trauma. And the French surgeon says, here it is, that if you run an open flame along the back of the person who's injured, it would help relieve some of the pressure. So Sumner undergoes what he calls excruciatingly painful fire treatments 7 or 8 times in France. And the letters, again, the letters he writes home are just these sad letters that say, I have these boils and suppurations on my back, but I feel as though I'm getting better, at the time. So he just can't really get back. Some people say that Sumner was faking. I don't think so. I don't think anyone puts themselves through that kind of treatment, if they're undergoing such pain. He does finally get back in the Senate in January of 1860. In June of 1860, he delivers a major anti-slavery speech called The Barbarism of Slavery. Has not lost his fastball at all. It's a tough speech. And ironically and coincidentally and appropriately enough, it is the last major anti-slavery speech in American history. June of 1860. There aren't many, there's not much in the summer of 1860. Once Lincoln's elected in 1860, the South secedes, the Civil War happens, and of course on the back end of the Civil War, slavery is abolished. So Charles Sumner makes the last major anti-slavery speech in American history. And when he dies in 1874, he's very active, by the way, in Reconstruction, very, very big in the 3 major Reconstruction amendments, the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery, the 14th Amendment that says the children of slaves born here would be citizens of the United States, and the 15th Amendment, which gives black men the right to vote. Sumner very active in all 3 of those Reconstruction amendments. And when he dies in 1874, his body lies in state at the State House in Massachusetts. About 50,000 people file by. It's a lot of people for a senator at that time when they pay tribute to him. And a little bit of a tweak to the people of South Carolina, I think, the Reconstruction government in South Carolina, in Columbia, lowers the flag to half-staff in Sumner's honor. Pretty interesting at the time. Point 2. There's only 3. Point 2. Some people say to me, would the Civil War have happened without the caning? Now you say the Civil War, that's not the cause of the war, but would the war have happened had there been no caning? Of course, no way to really know, but my answer is this. My answer is this. The caning, to me, is the emotional, raw, visceral incident that transforms the slavery debate from an academic debate, an intellectual debate, a political debate, to this very emotional one. I don't know if the war wouldn't have happened, if the war could have been avoided, but I do think it might not have happened as quickly as it did, even though it did take those 5 years. And I think anytime there is that extension of time, there is the possibility, perhaps, of compromise, even despite the fugitive slave law, even despite Kansas, Nebraska. There might have been that opportunity. Tough to say. There's a school of historians that believes that slavery would have died its own death sometime in the mid-1880s, early 1890s, when technological advances had been made, industrial advances had been made in the South. A synthetic fiber had been adopted that replaced cotton, the sort of polyester of the 1880s that made cotton no longer viable, and then thus slavery no longer viable. Hard to say all of that, but worth thinking about. Last point. So, think about this. One of the things I learned in my research was this, that almost every major stereotype that Southerners have of Northerners today, and that Northerners have of Southerners today, comes not just from the 1850s, but almost from this incident. So the Southern stereotype, or the Northern stereotype of Southerners as backward and crude and goobers and quick to anger and quick to fight, those kinds of things, all of those stereotypes that I think still exist today, are exactly what Charles Sumner's supporters were calling Preston Brooks and his supporters in the South. In the Southern stereotype today that Northerners, and dare I say Northeasterners, and dare I say people from Massachusetts, by the way, sorry guys, are arrogant, condescending, impolite, talk too fast, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of those stereotypes that are alive and well today were exactly what Preston Brooks's supporters were saying of Charles Sumner and his supporters. Pretty amazing stuff. So I always say, if you know the roots of stereotypes, it's not that you can overcome them always. That's, I think, a little bit of a dream. But at least if you know the roots of stereotypes, you can understand them and maybe deal with them a little better. So the caning, to me, a profound incident in American history 150 years ago, and in many ways still with us today. So thank you very much. Let me take some water and I'll take your questions. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, what happened to all men are created equal? Good question. So when you say what happened to it, I tried to give you a little bit of how the Constitution comes about and how it gets passed and how they sort of compromise at that point. But really, your question, all men are created equal, it doesn't really happen until the Civil War. I mean, the Civil War, and I think the document that kind of redefines that, sort of redefines equality is Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And so
The equality sort of thing was not really equal. They only let landowners vote.
yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there were certain, let's put it this way, there were certain rituals.
Women vote.
That's right, not till 1920, right? Yeah. So there's certain rituals and customs and things that have changed. But I think when you're talking about from a racial standpoint, I think it's the Civil War that's really that place where it happens. Lincoln redefines things with the Gettysburg Address. The war happens, and right after the war, in fact, right before Lincoln is assassinated, the 13th Amendment is approved. It doesn't get ratified till December of 1865, but it's approved right in that April of 1865 timeframe. So I think that's the change. Yeah. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Charles Sumner and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow?
Yeah. So that's good. Yeah, great question. So the friendship between Sumner and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I guess if there's an exception that proves the rule, Longfellow and Sumner were very good friends. Sumner does not have a lot of very good friends. Longfellow is one of them. However, I think still Sumner has a difficult time, even with their good relationship. And that relationship included things like, getting together for coffee and getting together at a tavern and talking about issues and those kinds of things. After Longfellow marries Fanny Appleton, Sumner is completely distraught because he writes to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and he says, whatever will I do? All of my friends are getting married now. It's kind of like today. You'll have somebody who hasn't married yet say, wow, all my friends are married. Sumner is not at all happy when Longfellow announces his engagement to Fanny. Not happy for him as a friend. And kind of bugs Longfellow to such an extent that Henry and Fanny take Sumner with them on their honeymoon to the Catskills, literally. Literally go to the Catskills, and Sumner accompanies the two of them to the Catskills. So they did have a friendship. But it's one of those friendships where, you can almost see Longfellow saying to Fanny, I don't know when he's leaving. You know what I mean? It's kind of like that. So, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting relationship, I think. Yeah. Yes, sir, in the back.
I have kind of a chicken and an egg question.
Yeah.
When you write a book like this, do you write it because you think the caning caused a civil war, or in the course of writing it, do you discover that you think the caning caused a civil war?
Yeah, so I'll tell you in terms of I don't use that word cause, but I do use the sort of no turning back point. So yeah, so the answer to your question, when I first started thinking about the caning, which has been several years now, many years now, I came at it with how did we get to this point? How do we get to this point where a United States senator is beaten to within an inch of his life on the floor of the Senate, even though they're not in session? So that's kind of how I came at it. And how big was it really? So to answer your question, no, I didn't come at it saying, I think this caning is the no turning back point on the way to the Civil War, and then go to support it. I saw the incident and said, I want to find out more about this. And then when I pick a topic or when I decide to do the research, I say, what are the things I look for? Number one, compelling characters. You do like to know that there's strong characters. Number two, are there really good primary sources? And there are in this book and in this story. And three, yeah, I have an inkling that the event that the event is part of something much bigger. So I knew it was part of something bigger, just wasn't sure how big, until I started to do the research and then found, wow, this is just, the whole tenor of the debate, North and South, just changes as a result of the caning. It's pretty interesting. Yeah, great. What else? Hey, hold on a second. I just want to see if anyone else who hasn't asked. Yes, yes, please.
In the book, the Republicans freed the slaves. So how come the Democratic Party takes credit for freeing slaves?
Well, I don't know if the Democratic Party takes credit for freeing the slaves. If they do, that would, of course, be historically 100% incorrect. I think what you're saying is that there's... I think what you're saying is that the African-American vote tends to support the Democratic Party today, right? Right. I think that's what you mean.
Yeah.
I don't think you hear Democrats saying we freed the slaves.
No,
Right. No, I just wanted to be clear. No, I think there's a shift happens with Southern Democrats over the course of the last 100 years, and Southern Democrats who were part of that sort of real anti-civil rights activity after the Second World War, for example, move over to the Republican Party. There's a shift north and south. So I think you'll see things happen like that in history, that there'll be big blocks, so a 50-year period. Let's take, for example, the so-called Reagan Democrats. Let's use that, right? So I'm the grandson of Italian immigrants, 3 Italian immigrants, right? So my grandparents always voted Democratic. Always. Immigrant parents always did. So a couple generations later, that's not so much the case. The so-called Reagan Democrats, the Democrats who voted for Reagan, were largely Irish Catholics, Italian Catholics, Polish Catholics, et cetera, whose ancestors voted Democrat almost all the time. So you see these shifts, I think, in voting patterns in a lot of American history. They're really interesting, I think. But yeah, so historically, let's always stay accurate historically, and so I think that's good. Yeah. Good question. That's a good question. What else? Yes?
There's nothing in the Constitution that says that a state cannot secede.
So are you,
Yeah,
so you said there's nothing in the Constitution that says a state cannot secede.
isn't that the basic?
Yes, I think you're right, literally correct. Lincoln saw as his mission to keep the Union together, that there could be no
Secession.
democracy.
No dissolution.
No dissolution, thank you for the word. There could be no secession, no dissolution, that the Union could not survive under such stress. And so his goal was to keep the Union together, and that's exactly what he did.
That was illegal.
You're saying, was it illegal for him to do that? I don't think it was illegal for him to do that, but I do think that there's questions.
States' rights.
You can have questions. You can say, should a state be allowed to secede? I think there's like a constitutional question that you could ask there, for sure.
There's nothing in
but-
the Constitution that says that a state can't secede.
No, I agree. I'm agreeing with you on that point. I'm not necessarily agreeing with you on the illegality of the war, although,
Oh, no, I'm not saying that. I mean, just saying.
but let me make a point. Although many in the South still do agree with that point of view. So there'll be,
Northern aggression.
yes, so if you, in many places now, we were in Vicksburg a few years ago, and it's often called the War of Northern Aggression still. Yeah, absolutely true. That's absolutely true. Yes, sir.
In terms of causes of the Civil War,
Yeah.
how much weight do you give to Uncle Tom's Cabin? Didn't Lincoln famously say of
The little lady who brought us the war.
Yeah, so Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course, is the author. By the way, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the novel was published here in Massachusetts by a very kind of, at the time, courageous publisher when no other publisher wanted to touch it. And the novel sells, I think, over 1 million copies in the first 6 months, which is a stunning, by the way, as an author, is a stunning number. But no, I think it's very, very important at the time. I don't think it's as important as the Fugitive Slave Law or as Kansas, Nebraska, but it certainly awakens what I would call kind of the general population to some of the slavery issues and some of the kind of the viciousness of slavery, et cetera. So yeah, I think it's a very, big part of the momentum, for sure. Yes, I do. And that's I love that question. I love that Harriet Beecher Stowe story. and the publisher here who publishes it, who was the only one that wanted to touch that novel. So, yeah.
Ticknor and Field?
It was Jewett, I think. Yeah, I think it was Jewett, yes. You'll read about him in the caning, and it's escaping me at the top of my head, but yeah. So, what else?
What about the presidents, Buchanan and Pierce? Pierce was very pro-South.
Pierce was pro-slavery. Buchanan was pro-slavery. Buchanan was probably, such a bad choice. That's Buchanan, of course, is the guy that John C. Fremont almost beats. Who knows what would have happened? Historically, who knows what would have happened? You always have those questions historically. But Buchanan.
His wife was very. Pierce's wife was the best friend with which was.
Hawthorne, the long one, Hawthorne.
Oh.
It'll come to you.
Lee.
Robert E. Lee. Yes. Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, sure, but of course, Robert E. Lee was a great member of the United States Army, and in fact, who captured John Brown on the raid of Harper's Ferry? Robert E. Lee, before he makes the decision to go fight for Virginia. Almost doesn't. Virginia, of course, doesn't secede till late. You remember that? Yeah. And Lee has this real struggle and finally says, I can't leave my state. So I think what happens prior to that, you could be good friends. So, in 1853, Franklin Pierce's wife being friends with Robert E. Lee's wife, I don't see any issue there. You know what I'm saying?
No,
Yeah.
didn't people resent that, the Northerners?
So think about this war, think about this Civil War this way. The term brother against brother, right? I mean, this is a literal term with the Civil War. So Northerners and Southerners, there were great friendships between North and South. In fact, in 1858, Jefferson Davis, who becomes the president of the Confederacy, right? He's a senator from Mississippi at this time. In 1850,
Zachary's daughter married Jefferson Davis.
yeah. So in 1858, Jefferson Davis, who's on vacation in Maine, on his way down from Maine, stops in Boston and says, "Let's let cooler heads prevail. Let's get back together. Let's stop this." But it was a little bit too late in 1858. I mean, there's great commerce between the North and the South. I mean, there's a lot of Northerners who, part of the Southern argument, when you read some of these debates in Congress, part of the Southern argument in the South is Northern hypocrisy. So Brooks makes this argument, I think, pretty eloquently. He says, the Southern slavery is keeping the lights on in the North, making millionaires of textile merchants in the North, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole hypocrisy thing that the South lays on the North, and I think kind of justifiably in some ways. But my point is, there's this, there's relationships between North and South. So that's what makes the war so tragic, I think. That's what makes it so horrible. This isn't a faraway land, it's not like that. There is this brother versus brother kind of a thing, yeah. So, no, it's tough to get anytime I think about 700,000 dead, think about this, right? 700,000 Americans is more than all Americans killed in every other war combined. So 400,000 in the Second World War, right? 58,000 in Vietnam. 38 something in Korea. So think about add them all up, and you don't get to 700,000 Americans. So that's why I think the war has the Civil War still, we're at the 150th anniversary, whatever. The Civil War still has this hold on America from a historical standpoint. That's why I think every 20 years, 100 books come out about Lincoln and the Civil War. I always say that when I talk about history. Lincoln's one of those guys. Go back 20 years, there's 50 books on Lincoln. Go back another 20 years, there's 50 books on Lincoln. It's amazing.
Lincoln won the war and lost the peace.
Yeah, there's all kinds of takes on it. There's all kinds of takes on, there is this whole school of thought that says that the abolitionist movement hastened the war. That because they were demanding uncompensated abolition, that the South, had you tried to reason and said, Lincoln himself originally meets with Southern leaders, meets with Frederick Douglass, and says at the very beginning of his presidency, here's what we should do. We should give every Southern slave owner $400 for each slave. And we should give him that, and we should put a corresponding amount of money in a pot and allow those slaves to migrate back to Liberia, wherever. That was Lincoln's original point of view. So there's that he was kind of struggling with. And he finally evolves by about early 1862, mid-1862, he's completely evolved. So when he issues the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 63, that's kind of, I think, his complete evolution, you know, at that point. But so there's so many takes on the whole issue, how it happened, how it developed. And that's why I think this caning, to this gentleman's point, that's why I think the caning is that no turning back point, that it's just that visceral, it's the, you know, it's not an exact analogy, but I'll make it. It's the pre-December 7th, 1941 versus the United States on December 6th, 1941, and the United States on December 8th, 1941 are two completely different places, right? Yes. There's a vast isolationist movement as of December 6th of 1941 that literally disappears overnight with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Literally disappears overnight. So those kind of visceral events happen in history, and I think this is one of them. It's not an exact analogy because, you know, we're attacked and we're at war in 41, but I just think it's close to that. Yeah. What? Yes. I'll get you next.
Say a little about Sumner in his last years watching Reconstruction basically falling apart. And
yeah.
That's what I want to know about. And
well, okay, so Sumner, it's interesting. Sumner is not of the Lincoln with malice toward none and charity to all school. He's a very tough abolitionist. He's a harsh, if possible, he was more hated in the South from 1866 to 1870 and 71 than he was prior to that because of that kind of attitude that he had. And at the same time, as I say, he's very instrumental in these three Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution. So I think he's a sore winner, I think. Maybe I can use that expression. Abraham Lincoln, I think, is the complete opposite. Abraham Lincoln wanted this sort of, okay, let's embrace the South. Reconciliation, yes. Right. And he did want that. I think he was legitimate in that second inaugural when he says charity, malice toward none and charity to all. I think that kind of defined him. And had he not been assassinated, I think that policy would have occurred. Sumner was part of the real tough Reconstructionists, so I think that's
because of the caning. Did that have much?
Yeah, I think it had a little to do with it, but I think it was just his general belief system. I mean, he had this real hatred of slavery from a fairly young age, and I think that kind of carried on. So, great question.
Thank you. So one more question, then we have to wrap up so you can sign.
Oh, okay. So who was over here that I said I'll get you next? Oh, it was you. Come on, did I really say that? No, I'm only kidding.
What's your next book going to be about?
Yeah, so I'll tell you this. Let me tell you this. I've been very blessed. I have 5 books out. There is a 6th coming. I am in the last stages of writing now. It'll be out next spring. I can't quite tell you the topic yet. But I'm dead serious about this. If you get on my mailing list, as soon as I can, I will. I will tell you. And I'm very excited about it. It's a big book. There's a lot going on in it. I think you'll enjoy it. And it's about narrative history, I can tell you that, which have been what all my books are about. And so, yeah.
History of Stoughton?
Okay, so see, that's it. Now, see, you can't keep doing that, Pat.
I just said local.
Yeah, no, you can't. I'm going to just leave it at that. And seriously, I mean this sincerely. When I say get on my mailing list, I only say it because some people are a little, some people, like I had a woman at a presentation say, you know, I signed up for Williams-Sonoma and I get an email every day from them. No, you will not, that will not happen. That will not happen with me. I don't have time to do that. So you'll get 2, maybe 3 a year, maybe. So I'm just saying that's the best way, I think, to find out. So,
by the way,
thank you very much, you guys. So you guys are awesome. Stoughton, awesome. Appreciate it.